Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to yet another casted video, and I don't mean game. It's of course a casted paper video, and we're going to be talking about the Mormon natural eugenics, well, question mark, and the broader topic of politics and fertility. So let's get into it. The world fertility decline looks something like this. If you've heard of anything about developmental economics, you know that as money goes up in your country, fertility goes down, and this is generally considered a good thing. However, it seems that many countries have gone a bit too far, since the fertility rate is now below 2, so that we are actually not reproducing ourselves. The replacement level fertility is roughly 2. Of course, that is children per woman, and since half of kids are men and so on, the math works out that you need 2 point some small number of kids to make the things run around. It looks more or less like this. You can see the different regions, and some regions reached this before. Europeans were, well, fast to go down, and Africans will follow suit in, some decades, maybe, according to United Nations. There is also, related to this, a world intelligence decline. There's two factors of this, and first, of course, is just that most countries now, well, so we think, have a negative relationship between intelligence and the number of kids, that is to say, a dysgenic pattern, and so this will over time select against intelligence, and the genetics, the genetic basis of intelligence will decrease, and eventually this will also result in the phenotypic intelligence going down. But there's another factor, which is that the relative proportions of the world is changing. There are relatively more Indians and Africans now than there used to be, 200 years ago or 50 years ago. And due to the difference in average intelligence between these world regions, this affects the average world intelligence. I was enticed to talk about this topic due to this Twitter exchange with the otherwise great account, A New Radical Centrism, who was essentially claiming that there is no global decline of intelligence. And I had to point out that it has to, well, it's a necessary fact of the changing world's populations, but since this is not so obvious, let's cover it in a video. I decided to also do this from scratch, not just theoretically, but you can actually just download the world population counts, and since we have the world IQs too, you can take a weighted mean across the years, and then you get the decline we would expect, just based on the relative population size changing. So to get some data, I considered some websites. The World Bank has this nice map, but the World Bank data only goes back to 1960. The UN has some data that go back to 1950, but they don't have this nice plot. So I've used the UN data just to have more years, and showing the plot here for the current fertility rates. Or actually, this is the population counts. They also has this website, and for the UN, where you can look at the annual rate of population change, and you can see that things that are not green means that the population is actually, when it's orange, it means it's declining, and this kind of dodgy light brown color means it's slightly increasing. But most of these are increasing due to immigration, except for East Europe, whose these people are immigrating over here. So really, though there are more people in Denmark now, there are fewer Danes. At least there will be over time once they start dying out. And down here, there's obviously a large increase. And since no one is migrating to Africa, this is from natural fertility. If you just take all the numbers and you compute the population for each part of the world, I've split them into these like 12 or so regions. Based on UN classifications, you can then compute the proportion of the average world, and you get this pattern from the 1950. And so we see that in 1950, Europeans and offshoots, these are the Anglos, New Zealand, America, and this sort of thing, they were something like 16% of the world population, and nowadays Europeans are something like 9% of the world population. So there is a relative decline of Europeans, and since Europeans are above average intelligence by world standards, this results in a decline. Eastern Asia, which of course also includes China, that has a massive population expansion here, but so did some other countries. Southern Asia here will include India and Pakistan and a bunch of these countries, and they've increased their relative share, so that now 25% of the world's population is now from Southern Asia. And Africa, as you can see, is just really getting started here. They will probably go up to, who knows, 25% or so in the next coming decades. Southern Europe is also going down. This one is the North and West Europe, I forgot to say. East Europe is massively declining, both due to World War II events and just fertility decline during communism, and lots of immigration to Western countries. So even though these people, the Eastern European people, are moving to North and West Europe in large amounts, North and West Europe is still losing relative proportions. So essentially, you just take this map and you get the average IQs for these, and then if you do that, you can get like this. If you're wondering about the kind of the lines here that are not moving, it's because within Eastern Asia, which has some countries like Japan and so on, their relative proportions could also be changing, and therefore Eastern Asia could also be increasing or decreasing its IQ relative to Europe. We see, for instance, that Central Asian IQ has been slightly decreasing, and that's presumably because there's relatively more people in like Kyrgyzstan now and some of these not so high scoring regions, and the Caribbean presumably is due to the relative less population growth in Cuba, which is relatively high IQ compared to some of those areas with lots of African prior slaves. The other countries are essentially stable, but if you plot the relative proportions in the world, it used to be that in 1950 or so, the world mean IQ was something like 94, whereas now we're down to 89 or so, according to these kind of data. If you do the Becker data, you'll get some slightly different numbers, and it comes down to which countries you're including and which IQs you're using, and so on. So the point is to look at the direction here, which is definitely downwards, not so much exactly the specific level here. So many people are, of course, interested. What can we do about this? And there's, of course, a lot of research of people who have looked about policy and fertility, and they have some, somewhat optimistic summaries, like this one that finds, childcare and universal transfers seem to have positive effects, and most of this you could kind of guess has to do with the Scandinavians having more kids and them also having quasi-socialist and universal healthcare stuff, which makes everybody copy Scandinavians. But it also makes you wonder, kind of, are Scandinavians doing, or Finns, North European people doing something else? And there's also, of course, America, which has essentially none of this stuff, and they still have a higher fertility, presumably related to religion. So American fertility should be dropping now, since American religious exceptionism seems to be killed by the internet. So they're going to join the other a-religious Europeans, and their fertility presumably will go lower. A better way of looking at this with our skeptic hat on is to look at an estimate like this, which looks at estimated elasticities of fertility with respect to pronatal incentives. So that is just economic speak for if you somehow give people money one way or another by paying their childcare or like lowering their taxes or whatever, and how many more kids are you getting per money you're kind of throwing into this. And you can get this kind of value. And one thing you see with these studies is that these error bars are a lot larger here with the studies that find larger effects, whereas the studies with tiny error bars all find basically no effects. And so it looks extremely much like publication bias. And there was some autist on, I think it is George Francis, who pointed out that the error bar here is also a function of the effect size, and actually you have to recompute them in a more fancy way. And when he did this, he actually found that there's still publication bias. So nice try, bro, but unfortunately it works out with just the simple statistics. So we cannot really trust these studies over here when it has this extreme publication bias stuff. This review didn't actually control for publication bias. It's typical economics where you just kind of assume everything that is PO4 or whatever is definitely truly correct. It's quasi-experimental, bro, and so on. And so we cannot. I don't actually think that much of these policies do much of anything. I think fertility is more organic. It has to come kind of from within. And so to talk about this, the natural or organic solutions, overt interventions are hard. We try all these like money things, and as you know, Hungary with Orban now, they're like, we need more kids and blah blah. So like women, you can get like tax free when you have 3 kids and so on. And Poland is also doing some of this. According to Metaculus, these interventions are not expected to be very successful, and since Metaculus is almost always correct, we can probably assume that is true for now. Definitely the last time I looked at the Hungarian data, they were not particularly optimistic looking, positive for this intervention working. So it seems that the Hungarian data is going to go down here in this region too. Pronatalistic beliefs, so beliefs that it's good to have more babies, they would of course have strong selection pressure over time. So historically they must have been widespread and intertwined with culture, since of course the cultures that were anti-natalist, they died out, just like the Scorpio people in Russia. And so we can really ask, what really associates with having more children? There's an interesting study that Gerhard Meisenberg presented at the London Conference of Intelligence last year. And he looked at the GSS, and you can, here's his big summary. You can, of course, take people who are opposed to fertility, so people who are old enough, and you can see what other things correlates with fertility in these people who are done breeding. And so he looked at a bunch of things, not just intelligence or politics, but also religiousness, censorship support, kind of like old school morality, punitiveness, freedom stuff, and the nanny state. And what you really find, of course, is you get the large effect here is the one for dysgenics with just intelligence, where we see as usual that the female effect is, I don't know, roughly twice as strong as the male effect. Conservative has some weak positive relationship. Religiousness also good, especially for men. Interesting is that censorship support is also quite decently strongly related to fertility. People who are into kind of strict old school morality, they have a lot more kids. And punitiveness, that seems to be not much association. People who are into freedom of various sorts, they have fewer kids, and nanny state support doesn't seem to have much relationship. So this kind of traditional left-right axis seems to be not so important, whereas essentially these like right-wing authoritarianism, religiousness, this kind of cluster associates with having more kids. And then of course the intelligence one. Which is interesting. So it seems that the fertility patterns indicate that despite the current quasi-communism takeover, the future is essentially right-wing authoritarian, even in Western countries. I mean, so supposing this American data will generalize to, say, Denmark. The effect of conservatism and fertility is quite strong nowadays, and seemingly becoming stronger. Back in 2012, J-Man, he also plotted the data. I also think it's the GSS. And it looks like this. If you just compute the average number of kids for, I think, for older women or even older men. And you can see that in the later birth cohorts over here, we see that the extreme conservatives, or what shall we call them, the far right people, they're having, maybe not twice as many kids, but they're approaching twice as many kids. And this pattern has been ongoing for a few cohorts, but if we go back to the earlier parts of the 20th century, there wasn't really that big a pattern. The conservatives still had somewhat more kids, but not impressively so. So currently, the future definitely seems to be going conservative insofar as genetics is concerned, and that is of course what Eric Kaufman talked about also with his religious book, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? But one thing is just the number of kids. The other thing is the quality. So we have a kind of quality-quantity trade-off. And so we have a double difficulty in that we have too few children. We need to go back to replacement or maybe slightly above for our welfare stage to make sense economically. But also we have the wrong people are getting them insofar as intelligence, social status, income, and so on is concerned. So how do we really get essentially smarter people or educated people to breed more? And the problem, of course, is that trying to incentivize it with money will have the opposite effect. It will make the dysgenics worse. So supposedly you paid people, say, $10,000 to have kids. And what you have to ask from an economics perspective, $10,000 would be more useful to relatively poor people than to relatively rich people. There's a diminishing return, since rich people like $10,000, that doesn't do much. It's 5% more income or whatever. And so to them, this incentive would not be very strong, and they presumably will not affect their fertility much, whereas you would actually just be boosting the fertility of the ghetto people and the people who are living on welfare and so on. So you could probably boost children numbers if you were to do some overt, like extreme money transfers, but you would just make the dysgenics pattern worse. So somehow you'd have to make the policy linked to, say, people's social status, and I'm sure this would be politically infeasible, and therefore we have this conundrum. We also know historically, though, that humans nevertheless managed to evolve higher intelligence, and of course Europeans and East Asians and so on, Jews, they managed to do this too. So somehow it is possible to, at least by nature, get around this issue, and that brings us into our study and really the topic of this video. And so we really ask, are there human groups that we can find that currently are beating the dysgenics problem and also having kids? And it turns out there is maybe such a group. It turns out that the Mormons, or as they prefer to call themselves, the Latter-day Saints of Jesus Saint Christ, or something like this, they seem to be different in regards to eugenics, and credit of this really goes to the blogger Audacious Epigon. He posted this slide some time ago, 2018, where he looked at the GSS, and you can see that the Mormons seem to have an increasing number of kids by intelligence according to his free-way split, whereas everybody else is slightly negative or so. And blacks are even more negative. The problem is, of course, that he didn't really control for age properly and this sort of thing, and didn't really do a formal study. So what we really needed was a formal study that looked more carefully, statistically speaking, tried the different methods, this sort of thing, check for statistical significance, because there's no p-values here. And so we did this, and the technical details, which of course you love, that's why you're on this channel, is that we were interested in whether the effect would be robust to a bunch of controls. So you can do it with no controls. You can control for sex/gender, blah blah. You can control for age and non-linear effects of age, which year the survey was given, a bunch of variations of this, race, and even the predictor and the age interaction. The last one is tricky because it may be, for instance, that Mormons or some other religious group, they had kids earlier, and when you're not using people who are done breeding and you only control for age, but some people start breeding earlier, so there's kind of an age fertility interaction. You have to also control for this, but controlling for all these things, of course, means that you will eventually run out of statistical precision. Nevertheless, some of the tables, we'll not go over all the tables, but here's the general idea. So if we start with the simplest model, we're just looking at intelligence, that is the G factor here. I don't know why it's big here and small down there. It should also be small down there. So that's just the intelligence. What you get is a slope of 11, which is to say the negative correlation of 11 or so. And you see that the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, they have 0.8 kids more than the non-Mormons. And there's a positive interaction between intelligence and being a Mormon compared to normal people. And you can see the interaction is 36, and the normal effect on the non-Mormons is 0.11. So that is to say this value, you add these two values and that you get a positive value so that is to say a eugenic pattern for the Mormons. So the question is then, does this positive value keep being there once we control for more and more things? And so we go to the next model, we control for age. Is this still there? 36, yes. What if we control for age? 30, okay, it dropped a little bit, but it's still there, P000, whatever. Okay, what if we control for the survey year? Yes, still there. And if we control for the survey year and age? Yes. And if we also control for the race? Yes. And if we also control for the Latter-day Saints and age, which is to say maybe they're breeding earlier, and we get this not exactly happy results. The interaction is there with a p-value of 1.4, 0.1.4. So 1% is almost reached, and the effect size is still pretty decent. Now the effect size of a general population is estimated at minus 0.2, and this one is minus 21. So that in this final models, Mormons are actually not eugenic; they're just basically neutral. You just add these two values together, and Mormons will be minus 0.1, right? And everybody else will have a long one. But nevertheless, you see the consistency of the Mormon results across all these kind of models, that we control for everything, and only here is there some room for doubt. And one thing to note about the model, the table 1 here, is we're using raw fertility as the outcome. So we're just looking at number of kids you have. Here we are looking at a different one. Here we're looking at completed fertility. So instead of looking at all women and how many kids they have, here we look at just women who are, women who are above 45 or so. And what we get here is like we get the same kind of interaction all the way down, but you see now the p-value, the second number in parentheses here, it's, you know, not even 5%, just above 5%, just below, a little bit more below, just below, and still below. So essentially all these values look absurdly p-hacked, but I swear there was no p-hacking. This is just how the numbers are. And the really reason for this, of course, is that we just don't have that many Mormons in this data set that are also, you know, more than 40 years ago, or more than 40 years old, and this is just the amount of precision we have. Nevertheless, the pattern here is quite consistent to this one, and it would be extraordinarily unlikely to get all these just below p factor, or just below 0.5 values, and all these, you know, below 1 in 1,000 values and so on, just by coincidence, if there was no signal there. So there definitely seems to be some signal, even though, of course, the p-values are very dodgy looking. A different way of doing this is that here we're looking at cohort standardized fertility, and so there's been, essentially here we're saying that there's been some secular trends in the fertility rate, and we could, instead of including like survey year in the model, we could also just immediately remove the effect of survey year before we try to predict fertility, so kind of a two-step model, and then this essentially gives you a different view of things, because the direction of evolution is really dependent on relative to fertility differences, right? If you have, it doesn't matter if you have necessarily replacement level fertility, as long as you just have relatively more kids than the other people in the same cohort as you, then you will, then that is the direction of evolution. If the overall population fertility is below 2, of course, then the population will shrink and eventually will die out. But nevertheless, it can still evolve in some direction before it dies out. But what we see here again is the interactions. They're all very small until we control for both age and being a Mormon, in which case the p-values goes to 1% again or so. But I mean, pretty much always we see some level of signal for this interaction. So all in all, probably it is true that Mormons are either eugenic directly, or at least less dysgenic than normal people. You can see most of these. If you add these up, this one will be slightly positive, this one will be slightly positive, and this one will be just negative. So here's the things we talked about. The p-values are usually very small, some of them are below 1,000, and sometimes borderline. The General Social Survey, GSS, just doesn't have enough Mormons. It has a couple of hundred, and there's nothing much we can do about this. We have to wait until more survey data is released, which is every 2 years. And of course, then we could look at this, or we could try to survey some Mormons or some Utah people ourselves. Some of these will be Mormons, some of them will not be Mormons, some of them will be some other Christians or atheists or whatever. So maybe that would be possible, but it's kind of large survey you need, because you need enough Mormons, and also because the eugenic effects are so small, you need to be able to estimate this interaction. So you probably need to sample 3,000 people or something, and that could be quite expensive. So we haven't done that, but we thought about it, and if some money were to magically materialize, then I'm sure we could study this more. I won't go all the other models, but in table 7, for instance, we have the similar model as to this one with raw fertility, but instead we are looking at the political ideology, and this is simply just coded as a statement, whereas politically, how do you see yourself? You can be extremely liberal, or you can be extremely conservative. And if you code these as 0 and 1, we know that then we know that this value here shows the difference between extremely liberal and extremely conservative, which is to say here it shows that the extreme conservatives relative to the extreme liberals have 7.5 more kids. And if you do this across the models, you can see that they have a bunch of advantages until you get to the final model, where it's actually significantly negative, but it's essentially because there's some kind of issue with the model. Trying to estimate this interaction leads to, apparently the model cannot tolerate all these variables. So disregarding this final model, you get all these patterns where you see that you have this political ideology interaction, and sometimes it is strong enough to overrule the normal dysgenics, and when you control for more things, then it's not strong enough. So for instance, if we look at the last model that produces sensible results, like this one, model 6, here we control for race and survey year and age and all these things, we see that the overall level of dysgenics is 0.32, but in conservatives, extreme conservatives, it's only minus 0.1 or so. And so the conservatives seem to be declining also in intelligence in accordance with the genetic evolution, but they're declining slower than the extreme liberals are, or the left-wingers. Visually, of course, we could also plot some of the models. I cannot remember which model it is we plotted, but it's one of the models we talked about before. It looks like this for the Mormons, so you can see that as intelligence goes up, and so in this data set, it's using the word sum, a 10-item vocabulary test. Definitely not the best intelligence test you could have. If you had a better test, maybe you get somewhat better results. -2 standard deviations, so that would be theoretically 70 IQ is here and over here. So you see that theoretically the people with 70 IQ would be having 2.6 kids or so, whereas the 130 kids, the 130 people over here, they would be having 1.4 children or so per woman. And in the Mormons, we see that they just have more on average, except for the people who are very low IQ, but you can see that this corresponds to 50 IQ, and clearly you cannot measure 50 IQ in this survey, so these results over here are really bullshit. They definitely do not correspond to people who really are 50 or 60 IQ. So take that with a grain of salt, that people who are very low IQ in these data, they seem to have roughly the same kids, but as Mormons IQs go up, they have slightly more kids, whereas everybody else seems to be declining. So Mormons definitely have some kind of alternative culture that affects this fertility pattern. Maybe they ban women from higher education, or they have extreme brainwashing with women and how many kids they need to have, or something like, Jesus loves kids. I don't know. The political ideology one, it looks like this. Here, if I plotted the different ones, so you see, as I mentioned before, the extreme conservatives, they're not having many different kids over here at the very low end of intelligence. The conservatives are declining slower. So you see that the smart conservatives are still having, an average of 1.7 kids or so, whereas the smart liberals are like at 1 fertility or so. These are the extreme liberals. So these would be, pink hair and all the whatever it is liberal things in America, AOC people, and these would be, Trump for the win people. And so you can see that the effect is quite large, and if you were to kind of extrapolate this over time, as countries become less conservative, you would maybe expect that their fertility patterns and like this would also change. And so this suggests, of course, the kind of far-reaching conclusion is that maybe if we made countries very conservative or religious, or maybe even Mormon, something like this, then actually we could beat eugenics without having to do these weird money transfer things that don't seem to be working very well, or even they may even make eugenics worse. We just need to be more conservative and religious again, and of course this is also easier said than done. Nevertheless, interesting thing I didn't mention here is that aside from Mormons, the dataset also has some other 12 various religious groups, and this includes the Jews and the Catholics and atheists and so on. And we checked the same model as the Mormon dysgenics one, and it's not true for any of the other 12 religions we examined. And these have larger sample sizes, so if it was there, we would have seen it. And sometimes there's like a hint there and here, but nothing is as consistent as with the Mormons. And so it seems that the Mormons relatively are unique in having this either weak or weak dysgenics or slightly pro-eugenics breeding pattern. And so the Mormons definitely are very interesting here. I would be very interested to see some data on the Amish people and the Orthodox Jews, which are kind of similar, very Orthodox or conservative ethno-religious, or religious groups. And it would be very interesting if someone knows about some survey data of the Hasidic Jews of Williamsburg in New York, or these other New York area Jews, or the Amish, or the Pennsylvania Dutch, all of these. I'd be very interested to have some kind of data for them. Dysgenics, as I mentioned, seems to be less potent for conservatives. Whatever the reason is, we didn't look exactly into it, but the normal reason when you check the reason why intelligence associates negatively with fertility, it's mainly due to women, and it's mainly due to women's education. So essentially suggests that if you were to ban women from higher education, or you said you can only go to higher education once you have, once you're married and have kids, or something like this, and something less authoritarian, then perhaps you could reverse this trend. Of course, with some cost, since you're now removing some qualified labor force from science or from other stuff. But then again, if you're like Brian Kaplan and don't really think that higher education is that actually much causally useful in itself, then maybe we should also ban men from higher education, at least highly limited, and this way you would get a lot more money freed up in society, not being spent on this higher education scam or racket, and this would all make things very nice. But it's also not so likely to happen, since of course education is our kind of democratic religion right now. Everything needs to be solved by more education, right? Anyway, factors. There's another model we didn't show here, but if you do a model where you both have conservatism and you have like religious a tendency, like going to church, and you have like being a Mormon, then these factors seem to be additive, so they add up. They're not just a proxy for each other; they add up, and so each of them have an interaction. And if you were to be, say, a church going regularly church going, that is every week, conservative Mormon, then your eugenic level will actually be quite high. So you would really be selecting upwards if you can manage to keep up this lifestyle, and that's interesting. So maybe we need to exempt church going from states, or make mandatory church going, or something like this. It seems that humans are not really suitable for this kind of modern quasi-atheistic society we've made. They cannot breed. It's kind of like the panda, right? We're not even breeding ourselves to reproduce our numbers. The wrong people are breeding. It's mental illnesses everywhere now. We have like more communism, and yes, it's all going the wrong way. Of course, the opposite would be the most dysgenics. Never go to church, very leftist and atheist. And so that's kind of like the new atheist of 2010. And with that said, this was a kind of interesting paper, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Of course, in the comments we'll post the paper itself so you can read it, the Mormon paper, and some other stuff, donations options, Substack, blah blah blah. And until next time, then, see you.